The Institute for Faith and Freedom at Grove City College presents Liberty Mail with the Student Fellows of Faith and Freedom.
Welcome back to Liberty Mail. This is Libby Krieger.
And this is Aaron Jenks.
Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode. We're here delivering the top conservative wins of the week. But this episode is actually going to be slightly different because we're not going to exactly track 3 wins, but rather 3 big talking points this week. So to start off, what is on everyone's mind and in the news cycle was the Virginia gubernatorial race. And we're not going to talk as much about the candidates and who should have won or anything like that, but I think this race specifically was a referendum on the culture war. So including critical race theory and the transgender movement. I know we're really big in Virginia in the education system. So I think what happened is we saw parents were really actually caring about what their kids are being taught in schools. And I think that itself is a win, is that parents got out to the polls and showed that they don't want critical race theory in schools and they don't want transgender ideology seeping into their children's education.
Or at least these parents don't want any education seeping in that they don't know about. They want to be informed about the process that's going on. And throughout the past year, we've seen the education system kind of blocking out parents, and then you see in Loudoun County them fighting back. And I think that was a huge part of the sway in Virginia. I feel like the Republican Party just targeted the issues better than the Democratic Party in this instance.
They had their winning issue.
Yeah, it felt like the Democratic Party was kind of disconnected from the voter bloc, and especially in the suburbs, you had even Democratic families just voting for the right side. And so good job for the Republicans to really hit the key issues that is facing either education or the economic difficulties occurring in Virginia right now.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a good point about how kind of we saw both sides of the aisle coming together against critical race theory, transgender movement, all of those issues, and being involved in their children's education. And what I think this is, I saw a really good article in the Federalist about how the culture war is the new big tent for conservatives. Because I think this is lots of time, it's more just a common sense issue, is you don't want your kids being taught that a man can be a woman and a woman can be a man. And similar along with critical race theory too, you don't want your children being taught to hate America. And I know that's a generalization of what it is, but we'll get into that later. I know you've done some research on that. But I think the more that the left becomes progressive, the more you're going to see this big tent culture war movement, where you're going to be bringing in moderates with the conservatives to fight the progressives.
Yeah, or at least as long as we see the kind of radical sides, their voice amplified as much as they are, then that big tent, whether it starts as conservatism and then the moderates who usually describe themselves as liberal come over because I can't deal with this right now on the left. Like, it's just too extreme for me right now. I swear, like 50% of America, you either have like a 10 on 10 on each side, and then there's like such a huge block in the middle that just wants to stay with American traditional values, even though they don't see it as traditional values. And then so they're going to continue to, I think, sway to the right.
Yeah. And I think what is especially interesting is a lot of conservatives say, oh, the culture war it's in the past and that's not the winning issue. That's not what people actually care about. But I think this right here, this race especially, showed us that is not the case and that the culture war is the issue of the time, at least right now. And yes, people do care about taxes. People care about what they're spending on gas because that affects everyone. But this is clearly something that people care enough to get out to the polls. And another really good thing I think about what we've saw all across America is that people started caring also about the local elections, school boards, which many Americans just don't think matter. And I think what we saw in Loudoun County, especially that transpired over the past few months, is parents started to realize it does matter who you elect to your mayor and your school board in these local elections because they do have an impact on your family directly and on America broadly. So I think it was bringing more people into the electoral process, which I think that in itself is a win as well.
There's a number of videos where just parents were just taken back and so surprised that their school board, their local community of like the high school that has 500 kids, and they're so surprised that the school board is overwhelmingly trying to push progressive ideals on them and then kind of just cut away of what has been like traditional for the past 20 years to them. It's just so
it's encouraging to see that people stood up to this.
Yeah, and it is really nice to just see parents, kind of the local grass movements. The culture war, like, I think a lot of times conservatives kind of want to toss it to the side, like you said, almost, and kind of focus on economic issues and like
at least like the libertarian-esque conservatives.
Yeah, and grab those kind of voter blocks. But more and more, you just see that the culture war is going to be in media constantly. It's going to be on cable news. It's going to be on Twitter, anything. And so we have to take a focus to it. And almost like it's a bottom up, so we see the grassroots kind of taking an interest, and hopefully we see top of conservative movement kind of grab onto that and motivate the grass movements and try to push them forward with this movement.
Yeah, because I mean, culture and politics are totally interconnected.
Yeah,
I think
unanimous.
Was it Andrew Breitbart who said politics is downstream of culture, and I think the vice versa is true as well. So you have to be willing to impact both if you want to see real change.
Yep.
And also not even just with the transgender critical race theory education issues, but all across the country you saw voters rejecting defunding the police movements.
Yeah, that was huge in this.
Minneapolis, I think, was one.
Yep.
I think Streeter said maybe it was Seattle, too. I'm not positive on that one.
Was
but
it Seattle, Streeter? Yeah.
Streeter says, yes, Seattle. So that is also big, is that there, again, was a rejection. I think this is another culture issue, that people want to kind of go back to these traditional values, and whether that's critical race theory or respecting the police and just at least holding them accountable, yes, but not going as extreme to defund the whole department.
Yeah, I think in a larger sense, like when we talk about either liberal Democrats that are swaying to the right on kind of these issues, they're not seeing it as, okay, I want to hold on to traditional values in some cases, but rather
common sense.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. Yeah.
Sorry.
They're like, no, let's reform the police. Like, if we're going to do anything, there are issues, let's reform them. We can't get away with them. We're going to live in a lawless society. That sounds horrible to me. They see what's going on in world news, and tyrannical governments are crashing down on citizens.
And crime rates skyrocketing.
Yeah.
You need police.
Local theft going crazy.
Yeah.
Thefts of like $1,000, just doing whatever they want without cops coming. So it's very much common sense for the middle of America to just see this and be like, no, we're going to vote against this, and we want you to actually do something that's going to fix it without taking it away completely.
Yeah, so all that being said, I think this is a huge referendum on where not only Virginia was at, but I think all across the country where Americans are at. And I love talking about the culture wars, so I think we'll get back to that on point 3. But I know you had done some research on critical race theory. Do you want to kind of go over what you found?
So I think we brought it up like 2 weeks ago or either last week about critical race theory. And there's a constant kind of theme in the media of like, okay, we're not going to talk about the specifics of critical race theory for whatever reason. This might not appeal to people. Or I know the right kind of casts out there that the left won't define it or kind of dumb it down for Americans because it's like this elite egalitarian like college. You have to be
academia.
You have to be a doctorate to understand these kind of things. So went into a bunch of research, read a bunch of kind of like I started with the American Bar Association, a couple of good articles, and then went into the originators of CRT back all the way to like the 70s and 80s. We're either looking at like Derek Bell or Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado. And so as I'm looking at all of these, there's a common theme of it almost seemed here. I'll just read it word for word without putting anything into it. So it says a critical race pedigree challenges the traditional claims that the educational system and its institutions make toward objectivity, meritocracy, colorblindness, race neutrality, and equal opportunity. Critical race educators argue that these traditional claims act as a camouflage for the self-interest, power, and privilege of the dominant group in U.S. society. My biggest takeaway from that was that it acts as a camouflage, and I'm like, okay, so often the progressive side kind of looks at the right and says, you're spitting out these conspiracy theories, and then they go ahead and their main issue right now is they're saying that it's like a camouflage. Give me some data, back it up.
Yeah.
Or a lot of times when I'm reading these articles, they make points about specific cases, like they talk about Brown versus education, and they make motivating and compelling arguments, but when their huge kind of common theme or their big points are that, okay, this is like a camouflage over the American system, that the entire system is corrupt and we have to restart it, it's like a French Revolution that we have to scrap everything in the culture, in the society to restart.
Kind of Marxist at its root.
I was talking to my buddy. His father is a political figure right now, but he's reading. Who was it? He's reading. I think it was either Cheryl Harris or a really popular book right now that's on critical race, and he's reading that with the Communist Manifesto. And after his words were that race and class are kind of interchangeable in both works, and then common theme. And so I looked into that, and it does seem to pop up in all of these things that if you're well educated on communism and you either read the Communist Manifesto, you see class interchangeable with race.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what we kind of talked about a week or two ago with how this is, critical theory is an outgrowth of Marxism. And so whenever you're applying it to race, you're going to see, instead of the dialectical problem of classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat going against each other. In typical Marxism, you're seeing the oppressor and the oppressed in terms of race. And so that's why we look at everything in terms of race with critical race theory. So it really is just Marxism applied to culture. And now to say cultural Marxism, Dr. Kengor could tell you that's labeled as a conspiracy theory now. And it's like a white supremacist thing, which it's not. It's simply Marxism applied to culture, and that's exactly what we're seeing with critical race theory.
And a lot of times with these critical theories, if they just came out and told the public, okay, this is where we kind of build our working from, I think a lot of people would either be more accepting to it, but I feel like their fear is, okay, we can't tell the public because they're going to reject us then. And then what does that tell you about
then you shouldn't be trying to push
basis of this? Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think another problem is, like you said, people are trying to avoid defining it because then they know it won't be accepted. But I think a lot on the progressive side are trying to have their cake and eat it too, where they say critical race theory doesn't exist, but it should be taught in schools. You can't have both. It's either it doesn't exist or it should be taught in schools. Therefore, it exists. So, like, for example, Terry McAuliffe, who's the former governor of Virginia, who just ran for governor in Virginia again, I think he was on some media show and saying how it doesn't exist. But then back when he was governor in 2015, this really good reporting by Chris Rufo, there was a PowerPoint from the Department of Education that, in quotes, embraced critical race theory as like culturally reimagining and re-engineering, another quote, re-engineer attitudes and belief systems.
It's funny to see governors like that say it's not happening or it is happening, because the stories that have come out about Governor Abbott in Texas, like looking into the educational system and kind of like applying, like trying to just see what's going on. People are going, okay, that's the first time that's happened beforehand. Then I'm thinking he had no idea, because the educational system is locally based and that's the powers that run it. So when we see governors are like, no, it's not, like Democratic governors specifically say, no, this is not happening.
Yeah. But then you see the
I'm
actual
led to believe
evidence.
you have no idea that it's going on because it's a local matter.
Well, do they not believe it, or do they not think it's happening, or do they don't want to say it's happening because it's politically disadvantaged? Like, it's a disadvantage to say that because they know it's a winning issue.
Through all this research, there's a huge disconnect of how it actually works in education process versus what the academia says about critical race theory. And there's just no kind of middle ground, or there's no figures stepping forward to be like, okay, this is how we're going to implement it in the educational process versus this is how it's viewed in the college system or the academia.
Yeah.
A lot of these kind of in academia, I can see why a lot of this is like kind of like pulls on you, and you can like, it's like, here, let me read just like two things. It just like said, we're working towards the elimination of racism as a part of a larger goal of eliminating all forms of subordination. Working towards the elimination of racism as a part of a larger goal, or opposing or eliminating other forms as gender, class, sexual orientation, things like that. You can get wishy-washy, but a lot of their first goal is like, okay, we want to, and we've seen this with like BLM, we want to stop racism in America. Who's going to oppose to that? Not a single American.
It's a euphemism to make it sound like something you couldn't oppose, or like a semantic, something like that.
And so it's like, it's really polling, as you want to believe it, But then when you get into the grit of this and then see how it's actually implementing in classes, you're seeing, okay, they're getting taught that this one class is almost a protected class, and if you work against that, then you are a racist, or if you don't support this class, you are a racist. And these are the kind of ideas that we do, that we see middle of America now wanting to teach their children.
Yeah. I guess I have 2 points I want to touch on responding to that. So about the academia point that you brought up, I think that's really spot on. I think there's a touch of like how we've seen almost like a realignment of the anti-establishment and like the establishment elites. I think there is a touch of like elitism in this where it's like, okay, well, if you're well educated and in the academic world, you support critical race theory. And if you don't, you're probably just not educated enough to understand what it really is because, you know, you didn't go to an Ivy League like the rest of us. I think there is a touch of that. And maybe that's not everyone, but I think that's certainly a big part of the conversation around it. Number 2, I think kind of goes back to our conversation on academic freedom last week, where I think what both the right and left fundamentally don't understand what education is. Education is indoctrination in some way. You can't just teach someone how to think without teaching them what to think. I mean, yes, maybe not exactly what their beliefs are in every specific instance, but by teaching something, you are necessarily excluding teaching everything. And so to say that I think even some people on the right are like, we're not teaching them what to think. Well, if you're teaching them truths, you are teaching them what to think.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a really valid point, and then that kind of makes me think of cultural aspects of like, okay, if we just have the school teaching and kind of like teaching them how to think, then that's a problem, and it's such a more complex issue that we have to look into. But kind of the conservative traditional view on this is, okay, school is going to teach them like math, science, social studies, English. And then the family is going to teach them their morals, beliefs, and that's going to build them up as an individual and kind of how to think and critical thinking. And now we kind of have a disconnect in our society where some people are saying, no, the educational process needs to teach them what morals are correct, what's right to believe about certain people in America. And then the family is slowly like dissipating.
Well, I think especially like your social science courses, like social studies or history, like the way you frame it will necessarily include values. Like you can't teach, there's no such, we can't access the objective, like per se. So there's always going to be some sort of subjective, I guess, or I mean, if it's truth, like if the way that we taught history before critical race theory was truth, then yes, there are good and bad things about American history that we should definitely bring to light, both. But framing it's in the way you frame it. I think that kind of the underlying truths come out. So critical race theory, you're seeing a different way and different truths, or they're not truths, but different things to pull from it. And that's why you are indoctrinating either way.
Yeah, I agree. And then when we talk about the left and kind of like using critical race theory, and when we talk about them using these kind of radical points in politics, it's so weird to me that they don't just kind of like want to find a middle ground immediately, or like, look, this is a problem in the like either this is a problem in the educational process, or this is a problem in X, and we want to try to fix it, like the police system. Okay, well, most Americans want to reform the police system. If we look at the educational system, we can reform it. Let's like, there probably are problems. There are problems. Let's work on it together. But they're saying no. Like they constantly want to scrap completely, wipe it down to the bare bone, and then build up again. Yeah. And we see this constantly in any kind of ideology that progressive kind of hold. Yeah. They even want to do it with America. They want to like, you see Antifa constantly like, we have to get rid of the whole system to restart because it's not working. It's corrupt.
Well, you can see that in their messaging. If you're teaching that America is fundamentally racist and rotten to the core, the only like logical conclusion is that you have to tear it down from its roots. The foundations are rotten, so you would have to start all over. And that's what these critical theories are teaching.
I think in practice that's what they're teaching, but then when like I'm looking at the academia, I think I read a total of like 8 articles. They constantly talk about like, okay, specifically how we use the law system. Like they say that the law system can be used to oppress whatever groups in America, but minorities. But then the law system can also be used to rebuild the society and correct aspects that are wrong, that are oppressive. And that's like that part of it is almost an optimistic part in their sense, but they don't preach that. Like they don't say, okay, we can fix these problems. They say we have to scrap everything. Like in practice, they leave that aside. And they just
that's the theory, but then what they do is try to actually undermine all the whole institution.
Yeah, it's really whack because I think they could, like I'm like reading everything. I'm like they could appeal to so many people if they went at like
a more moderate framing. Yeah,
but they just come to the table with an extreme view, like okay, we want guys scrap this, and we're going to implement our whole new system, and however many millions of Americans are like, no, I don't want to do that, and they're like, no, we need to do that.
Exactly. Well, that kind of brings us into our last point. Perfect segue about coming to the table as in politics. Because so last night we had this Jay Cost event. Dr. Cost is a scholar on James Madison. He also teaches at a local middle school, high school.
And he also teaches some college degree or classes.
Yeah, and we have a Mind of Madison series that will be coming out soon, I believe, through the Institute for Faith and Freedom. So check those out for sure. He knows so much about American history and James Madison. So we had an event last night, and he talked about how James Madison, one of his biggest contributions to the American system is being a great politician and bringing people to the table and having discussions and finding compromise. And that is something that we should, as Americans, strive for. Aaron, what are your thoughts on his speech last night?
So I loved how he really built up the political environment around Madison in that time and then compared it to now. And especially when he was asked questions, he really dove into details. But when we look at the past and we look at that political environment, it's so much more of an understanding between the two sides that okay, we're going to disagree, but I think it was Jefferson who said it, that he said, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Federalist, I'm a Republican.
Yeah.
Even though he was definitely a Republican.
Yeah.
And at the time, but the overarching point of that is that we all are all Americans. And so when in our case, in this time, when the left has an issue that they disagree with on the right, you're not my enemy, but we're going to try to figure something out and then come to a compromise no matter what. And then more and more in today, it's just not like that. It's so far off from what the political environment was back then.
Yeah, I agree. I think in theory, his speech was great, but I think in practice, it's very different. Like you said, because now we've come to a place where back then, like you said, there was a common identity as Americans. And I think we've lost that. I think you talk to Americans on both sides, and they see each other as enemies when they don't agree. And I think a lot of that is because we have nothing that fundamentally unites us anymore as Americans. What does it mean to be an American? We don't know. And I think you're seeing some of the country who the flag, for example, is something that is a racist symbol for them. And then the other half sees it as a really great patriotic thing. So if you're living in, and this is my question to him at the end, which I kind of wanted to talk about a little bit more too. I said, how do you come to the table when increasingly both sides are living under two different sets of reality, whether that's with the transgender movement, whether that's with critical race theory, and just our framing of what America is and what it means to be an American? How do you come to the table whenever you're living in two different worlds of what is reality, two completely different worldviews? And I think he talked about my example of transgenderism and how only 10 to 20% of America cares about that.
His words, yeah.
Yes, that's what he said. And I respectfully disagree. I think Virginia is a clear referendum that, and obviously not everyone who voted in the election was just voting on critical race theory and the transgender movement. But I think parents do care what their children are being taught in schools when there's transgender ideology coming in and saying that women can become men and men can become women. You're having a fundamental disintegration of American society where we don't hold any truths to be truth anymore. It's your truth and my truth. No, there's one truth.
And just to reiterate, so we have two opposing sides, and how do we reconcile their differences in America right now? Because they're just so vastly different. And opposing at the time, it almost feels like they're going at each other's throats. Shoot, I was thinking about this one point, but when we think about, he brought it up that let's say the liberals or the Democrats win, and then Republicans almost fear that their rights or whatever is liberty is going to get attacked and taken away from them.
Yeah.
And then it's a roller coaster.
Impending doom.
And then it's a roller coaster when the Republicans win, and then the liberals think that Republicans are going to take away their rights and freedoms. So it's
certainly a perpetuating cycle, and that's kind of just how it is right now, I think, because the two sides have gotten farther and farther to the sides. And I think a lot of that is reaction to, like, whenever one side goes farther, the other side is going to go farther too.
Yeah.
Like, politics are reactionary.
And hitting on, like, the transgender issue, when we see it constantly in social media, like, how are we going to say only, like, 10% of Americans actually care about this? And I feel like that's such a bad way to look at it, because I think so many Americans look at their neighbor and say, okay, I care about you, even if they don't look at their physical neighbor, but they think in a grand sense that, okay, I care about my fellow
citizen,
fellow human. Yeah. And so I think that's the appeal of, like, the liberal sense of, okay, we're going to help this oppressed group, the transgenders, and we're going to kind of be there for them. And that kind of increases that voter block, or at least the people that see it as an issue in America. And it's not just 10%. Maybe it's 10% who say this is their main issue, but the liberal bloc or the Democratic bloc is really interested in this issue, even if 20-something% of the moderates are not. Yeah. And so you have to be precise about how you break that down, because just grand saying that it's not an important issue, that's going to be such a disservice to the conservative movement as we try to, like, work with the left.
Yeah. Well, and I think also, so he mentioned Americans don't care as much about the transgender movement as they do gas prices. Yeah. And yes, gas prices are something that are very timely right now because everyone's getting gas, everyone's seeing that the cost is higher. So I understand that, but I think it's completely amiss to say only 10% care about transgenderism, and because we're seeing maybe that only affects in reality a small percent directly, I think indirectly it affects everyone. And I think maybe he's more libertarian in that, and that's kind of what I gauged from it, is, it's, if not everyone cares about it, we shouldn't talk about it and blah, blah, blah. But I think as a conservative, a traditional conservative, we do have an obligation to, even if it only does affect a small percentage, this is about truth and what is not truth, and teaching our kids, and that will form the next generation of Americans too. So it does matter, and it's not even just based on what we believe to be right and wrong. This is based on natural law and the transcending moral order. So I completely disagree with him. I think he's an amazing scholar, but respectfully disagree, Dr. Cost. Yeah,
and I was thinking about, like, leaders in the conservative movement, if they take to his point and they're like, no, this is not an important issue, we need to talk about economics, gas prices, because this appeals to the voter bloc we currently have. Well, I feel like the voter bloc that you currently have is also going to understand if you try to bridge the gap and try to grab some of those moderate voters and say, okay, the leaders say, we recognize this is an issue, now we're going to try to work with it without directly agreeing with what kind of the left, like, main voices. And so there's a way to do that. I mean, it's complex, but I think it's so much better than recognizing, like, we're going to care for these individuals. Like, even as Christians, like, we love this individual. We don't agree with, like, them trying to push policy that is, like, benefiting to, like, one group or something. Yeah. But we love them as individuals. And then same with conservatism. We're going to take them, accept them, but we're not going to try to, like, say, no, you're not important. Gas is more important than you. Yeah. Because then those moderates, I feel like, just look at us, or they look at the leaders in the conservative movement and they go, yeah, because behind them they're listening to liberals saying, oh, they're racist over there, they're bigots, and then they hear just, okay, transgenders are not as important as gas prices. They're like, maybe the people behind me screaming these things are correct.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And something else that I was talking to some other students who attended the event at the end, and how Madison, like, didn't want a minority kind of imposing on the majority. Yeah. But I think that's exactly what this issue is you're seeing maybe there is a 10% or even less, I don't know the exact number, but a percent of progressives who want to have this view of transgender ideology, and they are necessarily imposing that view on the rest of American society if you're pushing that in schools. And so it is a minority rule imposing on the rest of society. So I think it's exactly what Madison wouldn't have wanted in that case.
All really interesting points. The J Cost event overall was solid.
And good dessert.
And good dessert. But I loved learning about just like more about Madison, because honestly not a lot in high school was taught about him, or at least diving into his
Not that
personal
deep,
beliefs
yeah.
in politics, which is really insightful and helpful to what our political environment is right now. Thank you so much all for listening.
Thanks.
I know we're going to try to get out a Man on a Street video pretty soon, and upcoming we have maybe some guest visitors, some local students talking about important issues to them. So we're super excited about going forward with this. Thank you so much again for listening to Liberty Mail.
See ya.
Sign off.
For more information on this podcast or other programs, please visit faithandfreedom.com.